Hello and welcome. He made his professional mark early on with an Oscar for one of his first cinematic efforts and went on to make the gripping look into the ironic life of the late Ugandan dictator Idi Amin. This week on One, meet the award-winning film and documentary maker Kevin Macdonald. As a young Scottish boy growing up in Glasgow, he didn't have any real sense of the film history within his own family. Kevin Macdonald's grandfather, the Hungarian-born but quintessentially British filmmaker Emeric Pressburger, was famous for a string of big-screen hits in the 1940s. He eventually proved to be the inspiration for the young Macdonald to explore the film medium, quickly making a name for himself with dramatic documentaries, mostly based around people. His hits included the Oscar-winning One Day in September in 2000, based on the killing of Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics, and the 2003 BAFTA-winning film Touching the Void, reliving a disastrous climbing expedition in the Andes in 1985. In 2006, Macdonald received acclaim for his offbeat look at the life of the late Ugandan dictator Idi Amin in The Last King of Scotland, continuing to prove that Kevin Macdonald can add an intriguing twist to a look into the lives of others. Kevin, thanks for the time. It's good to have a chance to chat with you.
Very nice to be here.
Now, by all accounts, you're a pretty normal guy in what is a very unusual industry in some ways for that kind of person. Aren't you supposed to be the screaming, shouting, demanding type? Are you in the wrong business?
I don't think I'm in the wrong business. I think because I come from documentaries, and in documentaries we're not screamers and shouters because we can't be, because we have to be nice to people to get the stories out of them, as you probably know yourself. You have to be nice to the people you're making the films about. And my attitude when I go into making a feature film, I kind of take the same attitude as I do with documentaries, which is that I want to see what other people can do and kind of nurture them and get the best out of them. I'm not a kind of director who wants to have everything just so exactly like that. I want to see what other people will bring.
Well, how do you cope with the big egos and the talent, the way the talent behaves then?
Well, actually I've only worked with one actor who was very, very difficult, and I won't mention his name. But actually I found that every other actor that I've ever worked with, people think that actors aren't human beings, and I used to think that too, because it can be quite strange. But actually, if you can form a friendship and a kind of direct relationship with them, I find that you can get what you want, because they want to make a good film too. And I think most actors, actually, the ego is all about protecting themselves. It's all about when they don't feel secure, and if you make them feel secure, then everything's usually fine.
Now, you were born in Glasgow in Scotland, and actually you were born into a family that has strong links with the movie industry.
Yes.
Your grandmother was actress Wendy Orme, and your grandfather was the legendary Hungarian-born English filmmaker Emeric Pressburger.
Yeah.
At what age did you have a sense of being in a film family, so to speak?
Well, not really, because I think my grandparents had stopped being involved in the film industry long, long ago. My grandfather was a little old man living in a thatched cottage in Suffolk. He seemed, he was the quintessential Englishman, except he had an incredibly strong Hungarian accent his entire life, which he couldn't shake. And Hungarians, have the strongest accents of anyone. And so it was only really actually after he died, and I started to read the obituaries of his films, and he made films that are now considered to be classics in the 30s and 40s and 50s, things like The Red Shoes is probably the most famous ballet film. And I began to appreciate those films, and I actually ended up writing a biography of him, which Faber and Faber published in England, and writing that book, of course, entailed me watching a lot of movies, watching a lot of old films that were his and other people's movies to get the context, and that made me fascinated by movies. And so indirectly, he got me into movies, but not through anything that he did at the time when he was alive. But I look back at his movies, and of course they're made in the golden age of cinema. They're made at a time when everyone went to the movies once or twice a week, and something about that magic that era had, and the way they approached movies has gone, unfortunately.
So prior to sort of discovering this sort of legend in your family, what did you think of in terms of career? What did you plan to be, so to speak, when you grew up?
Well, I always wanted to be a journalist, and I went to university and studied English literature, and then I wanted to leave and get a placement somewhere, get my first foot on the ladder in journalism. But it was the early 90s in England, recession, nobody was hiring.
So the Guardian wouldn't have you.
The Guardian wouldn't have me, alas. That was my natural home. So I started messing around with a camera. And my brother is also in film. He's become a film producer. He produced a lot of films with Danny Boyle, things like Train Spotting. This is Andrew Macdonald. And The Beach with Leonardo DiCaprio and films like that. Anyway, so we started messing around with cameras together just as a sort of hobby. And then one of the things we made got seen by the BBC, and they said, why don't you make a little 5-minute film or a 10-minute film? And they liked that. And one thing led to another, and I started making documentaries and found I loved it, because of course making documentaries is really like journalism in a sense. You know, you're led by your curiosity, and you're trying to find out about subjects that you're passionate about. And so that's what I did. And then after a while, I felt a bit restrained by working for the BBC or Channel 4 in the UK, where you know, documentaries are 50 minutes long and they have to have ad breaks and all of that kind of thing. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to make a film like Hoop Dreams, which had just come out, which is a great feature documentary about basketball, or When We Were Kings, which is a documentary about Muhammad Ali and the Rumble in the Jungle, Zaire, 74. And those had just come out in the cinema, and I thought, wow, you could make a documentary for the big screen. And a documentary that is as entertaining as any fiction film you would see. So I thought, I'm going to want to make documentaries like that. And so I made 2 or 3 documentaries that were aimed at the big screen, including a film Touching the Void, which was very successful, and another film called One Day in September.
I'll get on to some of the films in a moment. How did your parents first of all, how did your parents sort of influence you? What hopes did they have for you? And then how did they regard your sort of shift into this area?
Well, I don't know. My father was in sheepskin, if you can imagine such a thing, in Scotland. So he was not anything to do with the film business. Not at all. He had a sheep farm and a sheepskin tannery, if you can imagine. And my mother who was Emmerich Pressburger's daughter. She had separated herself from the film industry as well, and lives in Canada now, actually. And so I don't think there was any expectation that we would go into films, but both my brother and I did. I don't know whether that was something genetic or just because you know that somebody in your family has done it, you think, oh, that's a possible thing to go into. But we grew up, couldn't have been further away from that world.
Can you recall the challenge you faced when you first tried to direct a documentary, first actually got behind the lens and said, listen, this is what I want out of it? Do you remember what the difficulties you faced?
Well, I think there's different difficulties I faced. One when doing documentaries and one when doing first fiction film. I think doing the first sort of big documentary I did was a film called One Day in September, which was a kind of quite hard-nosed investigation into the Munich Olympic Games massacre of 1972, trying to find out really what happened at that infamous event. And I remember sitting opposite some retired and very aggressive German police officer, and him just not giving me an inch and not responding to any of my questions, not giving anything. And I remember thinking, I can't do this, And then I got angry, and I started being aggressive back to him, and I suddenly found that actually he started justifying himself. And once he did that, of course, he'd opened himself up, and I suppose it taught me a big lesson about documentary, which is that you never know quite what is going to open people up. You don't know what attitude. You think it's always going to be the softly approach, but sometimes it's not. But it taught me more than anything else that actually, I think deep down, everybody wants to tell their story, and the camera acts as a kind of amanuensis, as a sort of hypnosis, allowing people to tell more truthfully their stories than maybe they would otherwise. I think people often speak more truthfully in front of a camera than they would off the camera, which is a really counterintuitive thing. Your
documentary, the One Day in September, which was focused around the 1972 attack on Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics, won you an Oscar. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a major defining moment, I guess, in your career. And how did things change after that? How much easier did it get?
Well, I think in England, the equivalent of winning an Oscar is getting a knighthood, I always think, because thereafter you're always called, sir, whatever, and every newspaper article refers to you, everybody, that it's something that's with you forever and denotes a certain stature. In America, if you win an Oscar, I think it's often it's the same thing. I find that, I can be mentioned in a newspaper article in a completely different context, and it always says Kevin Macdonald. Oscar winner. And I think that sort of sums it up in a way. It raises you in stature in some way, and that makes it opens doors for you. But of course, I won an Oscar in documentary, and particularly in those days, more than 10 years ago now, documentaries were very much the poor relation of fiction film. They still sort of are. I mean, most Hollywood producers would probably never seen a documentary and certainly wouldn't be interested. But then, of course, along came Michael Moore and made Fahrenheit 9/11 and other great films, and those films made a lot of money. So suddenly people were like, oh, people in Hollywood were, oh, maybe actually documentaries are a thing to be into.
Touching the Void in the 2003 movie caused quite a stir. I mean, it's fantastic, atmospheric, strong movie. Talking about life and death challenges for these two climbers in 1985 in the Andes. It caused a stir, I mean, among the climbing community as well, because of some of the choices they faced, and among the public in terms of general debate. Tell me about that.
Well, at the heart of this story, which is about two climbers who, when very young, in their early 20s, went up a particularly difficult mountain, unclimbed mountain in the Cordillera Huayhuash in Peru, the Peruvian Andes, and they got to the top of the mountain, and then shortly after starting to descend, one of them broke his leg, and it left him with a very difficult position, because was the one who hadn't broken his leg going to help the other one down or not? And he decided he would, and they started helping him down. They spent all day. It was a storm. It was a horrendous situation. And then, just as it was getting dark, he lowered his friend, the one with the broken leg, over a cliff without knowing there was a cliff there. And this man, Joe Simpson, was dangling in midair, and his friend, Simon, was holding on to the rope above. And he held on and held on and held on for up to an hour. And then he had to face the decision, do I cut the rope on this man and let him go to his death, or do we both go? And of course he decided, take my knife and cut the rope. And Joe Simpson went disappearing down the cliff, and as far as Simon knew, was dead. But extraordinarily, Joe didn't actually die. He fell through some soft snow into a crevasse deep in the ice, and amazingly managed to, with a broken leg and totally mashed up, managed to crawl back to the base camp they came from. I think 3 or 4 days it took him. So it was an extraordinary tale of survival, but also a film which for me was important because it touches on questions of faith, and I think, you know, can you believe in a God when you're put in that sort of situation, when you're not normally a believer? How do you cope when you don't believe in a divine presence, when you're put in that sort of situation? Do you crack? Where do you find the strength to go on? So there were lots of sort of bigger questions, profound questions, which were important to me.
Devastating choice to have to cut a line which your friend's dangling off. And the thing is, you said it for Simon, who had to cut the line, or chose to cut the line, it haunted him afterwards.
Yeah, Simon really was had broken a taboo in the climbing world. And he was a bit of an outcast for some time after this happened, even though Joe didn't blame him. Joe told everyone, you know, I would have done the same thing. But it seemed like it's such a stark kind of example of a kind of ethical choice that you know, you can't really imagine anything more stark than that. You know, do I cut the rope on my friend and send him to what I think is a certain death, or do I not? Do we both go, or do I kill him? And you know, none of us would like to face that sort of scenario. So dramatically, it was a brilliant story for turning into a film.
Your 2006 sort of big fictional story was The Last King of Scotland, a very atmospheric movie. And a lot of that was, you know, because it was set in Uganda at the time of Idi Amin's rise to power and so on. A lot of people tried to dissuade you filming that in Uganda, but you decided to go ahead. What difference did that choice make?
Well, I think it made a huge difference to the atmosphere of the film and to the authenticity of it. We were able to film in the Parliament building where Amin had actually been. We were able to film at his lakeside house. We were able to film using his actual bulletproof limo. We found his bulletproof limo filled with rats, literally, who had eaten all the cabling and everything, but it was sitting in somebody's garage, this sort of stretched limo, and we got it out, we fixed it up, and we used it in the film. So, and we even found actually somebody came out of the woodwork and said, oh, I've got Idi Amin's medals. I went into the state house, he said, when he was overthrown, and I stole his medals, do you want them for the film? So we used his medals in the film, because he was famous, of course, for having row upon row upon row of medals.
That's right. All given to himself.
All given to himself, his own orders, exactly.
In terms of any lessons learned from making that kind of movie,
Yeah.
what was it you came out with from that film?
Well, I think I came out with a couple of different lessons. One was that if you make something in the real place, if you make something in as authentic a way as possible, I think it has textures and levels of complexity and interest that you can't achieve just through your imagination. I mean, on that film particularly, we had people working on the crew whose parents had been killed by Idi Amin. And so that allowed me to feel all the time, because there's a comic element to this film, but am I overstepping the mark? Is this appropriate? And they would say things. They would stand up and they would say, he wouldn't have said that, or actually a better line for that moment would be this. The funny thing about Idi Amin, though, is that everybody you speak to in Uganda about him, you say, so did you ever meet Amin, or what do you remember about Amin? And they go, oh, funny thing about Amin, I remember the time when, and he'd tell a funny story, and then they go, yeah, but he killed my uncle. And it's that was so fascinating to me about it, is the way that comedy and tragedy were so intermingled in a way that I'd never actually experienced before. And that was what made that particular story so unique and fascinating.
You had two wonderful actors there, James McAvoy and Forrest Whitaker too.
Yeah, I mean that was really lucky to have someone like James McAvoy to play that role, because it's a kind of thankless task slightly. The showy part is Forrest Whitaker's part, playing Idi Amin. He's a larger-than-life bravura kind of performance. But James McAvoy is the thread through the film, and he's a kind of an unattractive person. The character is quite unattractive. He's somebody who is actually willing to really turn a blind eye to atrocity in order to continue having a rather nice time himself. It's a sort of I'm all right, Jack kind of mentality that he has. And James pulls that off while at the same time being incredibly sympathetic and fun to watch, which is really difficult.
You've been very ambitious with a project called Life in a Day, a YouTube project. Very unique, actually, where thousands upon thousands of strangers from around the world send you film clips they've recorded. Where did that idea come about, and what do you expect it to do?
Well, I'd made 3 fiction films in a row, and I was missing documentary. And then this idea came up. A producer friend of mine came up with the idea and came to me and said, what do you think? Should we approach YouTube with an idea to make a film? And that's what we did. We went to YouTube and said, look, when we use your site as a tool really to make a movie, where we ask anybody in the world who wants to be involved to film on the same day, on the 24th of July, it was 2010, and to tell us about their life really, and then upload that footage. And then the idea is that we're going to make a film which is a kind of portrait of the world in one day, using some of the best characters from around the world, but also using sort of little snippets of lots of people. I think there's going to be 500 or so different individuals in the film, in a 90-minute film. But the idea originated actually from the idea for me originated from something that happened in the 1930s and 40s in Britain called mass observation, which a poet and filmmaker called Humphrey Jennings started. And mass observation was an idea whereby people were asked around Great Britain to write diaries all on the same day, and there were about 1,000 volunteers who would write a diary about their ordinary life, and then those diaries would be put into a book about that day. And they'd also ask them questions, things like, what have you got on your mantelpiece? What's in your pockets? What graffiti did you see today? So I thought there's something very interesting in that idea, kind of anthropology, using not the written word, but using cameras in our case. And just to sort of analyze what may seem like banalities to you, but actually, when taken as a whole, I think turn out to be quite significant. One of the questions that we ask people is, what do you got in your pockets? And the extraordinary things you get out of people's pockets and the stories they tell you about them, it gives you such an insight into them.
Although a lot of that material was unusable, it was amazing how willing people were to be intimate with their details, how much they gave away about their lives.
I think that's the extraordinary thing that happens when people film themselves, when they feel they're in control, is that they will film themselves on the toilet. They will film themselves when they're dying of cancer. They will film themselves at the moment they're being rejected by the one they truly love, which is a clip we have, somebody saying, I'm going to propose to this person today, and then she rejects him. And people, I think, would never allow that kind of stuff to be recorded by a film crew. But if they feel they're in control of it, then they'll do it, and then they're inordinately generous in sharing that with everybody else, which is also, to me, extraordinary. It's one of the features of YouTube and of the internet as a whole, is that there is this whole generosity of spirit, that people were actually willing to give their time in order to create something for other people to enjoy, and just as a pure expression, I think.
You in terms of what you found from that, though, I gather, is that there's a uniformity in people around the world, no matter where they are, no matter what their status. We share more in common than we have different. Isn't that right?
We have all basically got the same things that preoccupy us. Babies, love, illness, death. And that's really kind of the basics of life, the fundamentals of human existence. If you really ask people what's important to you, what preoccupies you, what's on your mind, we can all talk about, our hobbies and our this and our that, but really, when it comes down to it, we all are preoccupied by the same simple things. So actually, the process of making this film has been, for me, quite an eye-opener, and made me actually much more optimistic about humankind in a way. Actually, it's made me feel that, we are all one.
You yourself married with kids, 3 boys, a family. It's a very demanding business, the film world. How do you balance personal and professional life? Is it easy?
No, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. Every feature film I've done, I've been away for at least 6 months, and maybe more, from my 3 young kids and my wife, and that's very tough on them and tough on me. And I think you can't go on doing that. And actually, I'm trying to do more things at home that base me in London. But of course, if you're ambitious and you want to do interesting projects, you can't stay at home forever. So, yeah, it's I think for all film people, it's a real problem. And there's a reason why so many failed marriages and one thing and another in our business.
In terms of unlimited budget, unlimited opportunity, if you could take on a project, do you have anything in mind?
Well, if I had an unlimited budget, there is a project that I'd like to do, but I don't think anyone will ever finance it, because it's probably so expensive and so abstruse. But there's a wonderful Viking saga, or a novel that is kind of masquerading as a Viking saga, written in the 1940s, called The Long Ships, that a friend introduced me to a few years ago, which I think would make the most brilliant film. But so far, nobody's bitten on that. So that's my dream. That's my dream project. That, or Cortez's Conquest of Mexico. That would also be a great film. I would love to do that movie. But again, it's vast, and various people have tried that one, but nobody's succeeded.
You're still young in your career, and you've achieved a lot and a lot of awards. But if I could ask you how you'd like to be remembered, or what you'd like your legacy to be, what would you say?
Legacy. That seems such a big concept. I think what I really have found that I enjoy is mixing documentary and drama. Not just in my career, doing both, which I think I have such fun doing both. I don't see why so many filmmakers only do one or the other. I think they both give you some totally different pleasures. But also just in terms of bringing some of the elements of documentary into fiction, trying to create things that have a reality or a sense of authenticity about them.
It's telling a story, really.
Yeah, I mean, obviously to have made some good films. I mean, that's the thing. If you can look back in 40 years' time and say, you know what, I made some good films. Those were good stories, and they stand up. I'd like to watch that film now. And you can't ask for more than that. We'll see whether I manage to achieve that.
And your grandfather will be proud of you.
If I achieve it. His films are still watched. They just re-released The Red Shoes. Actually, Martin Scorsese paid for a restoration of the film, and it's beautiful. It showed at Cannes last year, and that made me very proud. It actually puts your own small career into its context. If you can have a film that's lasted 60, 70 years and still entertains people, that's quite something.
And Kevin, I wish you luck. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you.